They teach you that warfare is an art of maneuver, a symphony of calculated risk, a dance of flanking and superior initiative. That is a lie sold to peacetime generals. Real war, the one we are fighting now, is simple physics. It is the calculation of mass. The mass of steel you can throw versus the mass of steel your enemy can absorb, produce, and then throw back at you. We were told this offensive was about will, the unyielding will of the German soldier. I knew it was about oil. And the tanks, lined up in the oppressive cold of the Eiffel Forest, were already thirsty. I pressed my fingertips against the map table, tracing the thin blue lines of the rivers that snaked through the Belgian Ardennes. My corps, the spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army's northern drive, was tasked with the impossible: breach the American lines, cross the Meuse, and seize Antwerp within 7 days. 7 days. The distance alone was 150 kilometers of difficult terrain. The air in the subterranean command post was thick and stagnant, a cocktail of damp earth, burning low-grade coal, cheap tobacco, and the metallic tang of unwashed fear. It was precisely 3 o'clock hours. The attack was scheduled for 5:30. I looked at Major Heydrich, my chief of staff, whose face, usually smooth and impassive, was etched with fatigue under the sputtering electric lantern. He was chewing his lip, a gesture I hadn't seen since the failed attempt to relieve Stalingrad. "Heydrich," I said, my voice low and flat, keeping the tremor out of my throat. "The latest consumption estimates. Be brutally honest." He opened a worn ledger, the paper slick with moisture. "General, the preliminary movements have already cost us 10% more than projected. The roads are turning to sludge beneath the tracked vehicles. The cold is robbing the engines of efficiency. If we adhere to the planned rate of advance, 60 kilometers on the first day, we will be operating on reserves by the evening of the 18th, well short of the Meuse." I nodded slowly, the confirmation of the catastrophe I already calculated. We were launching a strategic gamble where the core variable, fuel, was assumed, not secured. We were dependent on capturing American gasoline depots, literally running on the enemy's logistics. This wasn't blitzkrieg. It was professional suicide dressed up as a miracle cure. "And the weather?" I asked, looking up at the heavy timber ceiling, beneath which sat 5 meters of frozen mud and rock. "Holding, General. The fog is absolute. A gray, dense shroud that smells of moss and decay. Visibility is less than 50 meters on the high ground. The Tommy and the Amos won't see us coming. The Luftwaffe won't see us at all, but then again, that's a minor consolation." I allowed myself a grim, humorless smile. The fog was our only friend. Without it, the vast American and British air fleets would turn our proud panzers into burning wrecks within hours of the breakthrough. The sky, once ours, was now the enemy's silent, invisible weapon. I walked over to the large-scale terrain model of the St. Vith sector. The American defenses here were thin, held by a mix of green, replacement divisions, and exhausted veterans. It was the weakness in their center that Hitler had spotted, the soft underbelly we were meant to stab. "They are too complacent," I murmured, running a finger over a miniature hillock. "They believe the Ardennes is too rugged for a major operation in December. That arrogance is our only tactical advantage." Heydrich cleared his throat. "General, the men. They are young. Too many Volksgrenadiers. They lack the spirit of 40. I turned, my eyes meeting his. "Then we must replace spirit with precision, Major. We lead them forward. We do not stop. We cannot afford to fight prolonged battles over unimportant towns. The goal is Antwerp. Everything else is distraction." But even as I spoke the words, they tasted like ash. Every professional fiber in my body screamed that this was an operation based on delusion. The speed required was unsustainable. The terrain was treacherous. And the enemy, though surprised, possessed an industrial capacity that made every tank we lost irreplaceable, while theirs merely signaled a minor delay in transit from the ports. A sharp rap on the steel door. It was Lieutenant Kessler, the signals officer, his face pale beneath his steel helmet. "General, the final code word has been received from Führer Hauptquartier. Wacht am Rhein is green. 5:30 hours." The moment had arrived. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, a tiny, frantic sound in the heavy silence. I picked up my field cap and pulled on my thick, black leather coat, the weight of the sheepskin lining suddenly feeling insignificant compared to the weight of the coming failure. "Gentlemen," I announced, strapping my holster across my chest. We go to war for the last time. Tell the commanders, maximum speed, maximum brutality. We must be ghosts in the fog. God help us if the sun ever decides to rise. I left the bunker and stepped into the pre-dawn cold. The air hit me like an ice-cold cloth, sharp and clean, cutting through the stale bunker smell. Above, the fog was a thick, silent blanket, absorbing all sound, promising surprise. Below, I heard the throaty rumble of hundreds of idling engines. Panthers, Tigers, self-propelled guns, all waiting for the precise second to surge forward. The roar built slowly, then peaked as the first shells from the supporting artillery screamed overhead, tearing the silence to shreds. The earth vibrated, a deep, resonant hum that traveled up my boots and settled in my teeth. This was the charge of the dead, the last throw of a desperate man. And I, Kuno von Falkenhayn, was ordered to lead the execution. The initial breakthrough was exhilarating, a brief, blinding flash of the old blitzkrieg glory that we had all begun to doubt was still possible. The Americans, mostly the inexperienced 106th Division, were caught completely flat-footed. They were sleeping, drinking coffee, or simply shivering in poorly prepared foxholes. Our tanks, emerging from the gray curtain of fog and snow, were simply too much, too fast. We didn't fight. We rolled over them. By midday on the 16th, the American front had dissolved into isolated pockets of resistance. We took prisoners by the hundreds, disoriented and visibly shocked young men from Minnesota and Texas, who looked less like soldiers and more like lost farm boys in heavy parkas. I rode in my command vehicle, a heavily armored Panther, pushing through the chaos. The roads, if one could call the muddy tracks roads, were littered with abandoned American trucks, stacks of rations, and sometimes the quickly discarded remains of the infantry. "Look at them run, General." Lieutenant Colonel Gerlach shouted over the noise of the engine, his face alight with manic enthusiasm. "They panic easily. They haven't got the stomach for a fight in the mud. They have the stomach for production, Gerlach." I corrected him, looking out at the endless stream of supplies we were already looting. Tinned meat, real coffee, cartons of high-octane gasoline. And that, ultimately, is far more deadly than their courage. The problem started not with the enemy, but with ourselves. The sheer volume of vehicles necessary for the assault, tanks, fuel carriers, artillery tractors, bridging equipment, infantry half-tracks, created an immediate, insurmountable traffic jam. The Ardennes roads were not built for 3,000 heavy vehicles moving simultaneously. We had achieved a spectacular 30-kilometer penetration by nightfall. But every kilometer cost us time and cohesion. The columns stretched back, nose to tail, for kilometers into Germany. If the fog lifted, this enormous, slow-moving slug of steel would be a perfectly visible target for enemy bombers. Our engineers worked frantically, trying to fill craters and reinforce weak bridges, but they were perpetually hours behind the rapidly advancing spearhead. On the morning of the 17th, the fog remained, a blessing, but the movement slowed to a crawl. We began to encounter the veteran American divisions, the 2nd and 99th Infantry, dug in around the key crossroads of St. Vith. St. Vith. It was a secondary objective, meant to be bypassed and choked off. The plan demanded speed. It demanded we leave pockets of resistance to wither on the vine while we pressed for the Meuse. But the sheer density of the terrain forced us into frontal engagements. My lead divisions, hungry for easy plunder and eager to clear the path, began to engage the entrenched Americans with too much commitment. I arrived at the forward command post, a hastily established setup near a smoking, half-destroyed farmhouse. The air smelled sharply of diesel, cordite, and burning timber. General Lutwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, met me, his face drawn. "Kuno, we are stalled here. St. Vith is a fortress. We need the infantry to dislodge them, but the roads are too choked to bring them forward quickly. You must bypass it, Walther," I insisted, stabbing a finger at the map. "Every hour here is a fatal wound to the entire operation. We must be past the line of communications before the Allies realize what is happening. Use the northern route. Press hard for Hoffeleis." Lutwitz shook his head, frustration boiling in his eyes. "The northern route is worse, General. Bogged down with the heavier artillery. We lose too many vehicles to mud and mechanical failure. Besides, the resistance at St. Vith is tying down the 5th Panzer Army to the south. If we don't clear it, our flank is exposed. He wasn't wrong. The professional instinct of every German commander was to clear their flanks. But this operation was designed to defy that instinct. It required an almost suicidal commitment to the main objective, ignoring all secondary threats. "Walther," I said, looking him straight in the eye, "we have fuel for 3 more days of heavy maneuver, maximum. We are not fighting for territory, we are racing the calendar. St. Vith will not win the war for us. Antwerp might delay our defeat." But the die was cast. The momentum was broken. The fight for St. Vith dragged on, minute by agonizing minute. The Americans, even those green troops, fought with a stubborn tenacity born not of superior training, but of desperation. They had nowhere to retreat to, and they knew the woods better than we did. I spent the rest of the day observing the piecemeal assault. It was a horrifying spectacle of waste. A single American anti-tank gun team, well concealed, could halt an entire company of armor, forcing us to call up infantry support and heavy artillery, burning hours and, critically, precious liters of gasoline. By midnight, we had cleared only half of the St. Vith perimeter. We had lost several crucial King Tiger tanks, not to enemy action, but simply to running out of fuel while maneuvering or getting irretrievably stuck in the frozen mud. As I watched the exhausted engineers try to drag a 50-ton Panther out of a ditch with a straining half-track, I knew we had missed the critical window of opportunity. The planned 48 hours of operational surprise were nearly over. We had burned 12 hours securing a village that mattered only to local pride. The first frost bit deep into the bone. The sound of distant artillery, American batteries finally finding their range, sounded like the slow, deliberate tolling of a great bell, announcing the arrival of the inevitable reaction. I closed my eyes briefly, the smell of burning oil and the damp forest floor filling my lungs. This was the first great failure of the operation. The professional army, too proud to bypass a fight, had allowed its discipline to be undermined by the lure of immediate tactical success. We were fighting like we did in 1940, with the resources of 1944. And 1944 had no forgiveness left. The advance became a slog, not a blitz, but a grinding push against terrain, logistics, and increasingly, stiffening American resistance. The roads were our executioners. My Panther Corps was meant to be the lightning, but we were the bogged-down mud turtle. I moved constantly, trying to untangle the snarled mess that was our supply line. The sight was nauseating. Hundreds of vehicles, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, sat idling, their crews asleep, huddled together for warmth, or desperately trying to dig the vehicles out of the muck. In some sections, the road was only wide enough for one column, forcing long, agonizing waits. I remember standing on the shoulder of a forest road on the 19th, near the village of Houffalize, watching the convoy creep past. The men were no longer elated. They were gray-faced, exhausted, their uniforms patched and thin. I saw the Volksgrenadiers, the recent conscripts, their eyes wide with confusion and cold, shivering despite the thick greatcoats. This was not the victorious army of the Western Campaign. This was a tired, hungry ghost. The contrast with the captured American equipment was stark. We confiscated boxes of their rations, chocolate, white bread, canned peaches. Our rations were hard bread, watery soup, and thin coffee substitute. The sheer physical disparity was a constant, damning reminder of who held the industrial upper hand. The fuel reports arrived that evening, delivered by a frantic dispatcher who had spent 6 hours driving 50 kilometers through the traffic. The numbers were catastrophic. General, consumption rates are at 180% of projection due to continuous idling and the state of the terrain. The 9th SS Panzer Division reports critical low reserves. They are down to emergency rations. I slammed my fist onto the map table, a rare display of temper. Emergency rations. We are 3 days in. We haven't even seen the Meuse yet. We have to start seizing the fuel now, General, regardless of our main objective, Heydrich suggested, his voice trembling slightly. We must prioritize the capture of smaller dumps closer to the line, perhaps in Bastogne or Marquet. Bastogne, I spat the word out. The name sounded absurdly small for the strategic importance we were now inadvertently lending it. It was another crossroads, another point we should have bypassed. But now, It was drawing us in like a black hole. And then there was the radio. The continuous, screeching noise from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW. Hitler's headquarters, isolated in the bunker in East Prussia, remained completely oblivious to the reality on the ground. The messages were filled with delusional demands. Speed must be maintained. No halt for fuel. The American forces are collapsing. Press the advance immediately towards the Meuse and prepare to cross. The destruction of the enemy forces is mandatory. I dictated a reply, carefully selecting every word to sound obedient yet pragmatic. I avoided mentioning the mud, the traffic, or the lack of fuel. I simply stated, local resistance heavier than anticipated. Executing necessary consolidation of forces before crossing key terrain features. It was a lie, but the alternative, telling the Führer that his last great offensive was strangling itself on logistics, would lead to my immediate dismissal, if not worse. And if I were gone, who would protect these exhausted men? The psychological pressure was immense. Every commander was pulled in two directions, the Führer's unrealistic orders demanding a breakneck pace, and the physical reality of the tank's empty fuel gauges. We burned fuel simply to keep the crews from freezing to death. I authorized the use of gasoline for heating the tank compartments during the paralyzing overnight traffic jams. It was insane, sacrificing the ability to fight the enemy for the sake of basic human survival. But I could not ask men to freeze in their steel coffins while waiting for a push that might never come. By the 21st, we were stuck. My corps had achieved its maximum penetration. We were within striking distance of Dinant and the Meuse River bridges, but the last 30 kilometers felt like 300. The tanks moved in spasms, a few kilometers, then a dead halt. The advance was now measured not in hours, but in how long it took the engineers to clear the latest obstacle. The air remained thick and low, a heavy, merciful gray. But I looked at the sky constantly. I knew the moment that gray shroud lifted, the game was over. We were a massive, stationary target, ripe for the plucking. We had achieved tactical surprise, but we had lost the strategic race against time and gravity. The reports filtered in slowly, carried by dispatch riders whose faces were caked with road grime and despair. The overall strategic picture was disintegrating. Our southern flank, where the 5th Panzer Army was supposed to be running parallel to us, was utterly hung up at Bastogne. Bastogne, the tiny, vital crossroads, defended by the American 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. I had considered the Americans' airborne troops to be excellent fighters, but only when used offensively. Their defensive capability, particularly when isolated and surrounded, was proving something truly exceptional, something we had not accounted for in our cold calculations of morale. I called an impromptu conference in a shattered Belgian church near the town of La Roche. The place smelled of plaster dust and spilled communion wine. General Manschufel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army to the south, contacted us via a crackling radio link. His voice was taut with frustration. "Kuno, we are tied up. The Americans at Bastogne refuse to break. Our encirclement is complete, but they are holding the perimeter. We cannot bypass them entirely. Their artillery fire is making the roads impassable. We are wasting men and time trying to squeeze the pocket closed. Leave them, Walther. Starve them out." I yelled into the microphone, ignoring the looks from my staff. The strategic objective is Antwerp, not capturing a handful of paratroopers. Every moment you spend besieging that crossroads is a gift to Patton. Manschufel's voice was distorted by static, but the meaning was clear. Patton's Third Army is already moving. Fast. They are coming up from the south like a motorized tidal wave. If we leave Bastogne, they will link up and shatter our flank. The professional soldier in me understood the dilemma, but the strategic historian in me saw the fatal error. We were fighting a total war with partial resources. We could not afford to fight local battles of attrition. I stood up and stared at the massive wall map. This was the moment of complete, unadulterated clarity. The ultimate revelation. The battle was lost not because of Bastogne's defiance, but because of what Bastogne represented, the sheer, inexhaustible depth of the American military machine. An internal monologue. We thought they were soft, spoiled, and ill-prepared. And they were, initially. But the moment the 101st Airborne was surrounded, what happened? Did they run? No. They hunkered down. They used their excellent communication equipment, their plentiful ammunition, and their endless supply chain, which, though momentarily disrupted, was merely waiting for the weather to clear. We, on the other hand, had to make every shell count. Every liter of fuel was a strategic asset. When a supply truck was destroyed by a random artillery round, it wasn't just a truck. It was the entire forward momentum of a division. I looked at the captured fuel estimates again. The American depots we were supposed to seize were either empty, destroyed, or too far ahead to reach with our remaining range. We were supposed to cover 100 kilometers in 3 days. We covered 60 and consumed 80% of our fuel. I began to see the logic of the situation not through the lens of tactical engagement, but through the cold, cruel lens of industrial economics. We were trying to defeat Detroit with audacity. Detroit was capable of stamping out a Sherman tank faster than we could repair a Panther's broken track. They could ship more fuel across the Atlantic in a week than we had stored in the entire Eifel region. Their resilience was not ideological, it was metallurgical. It was measured in tons of steel, barrels of oil, and kilometers of supply rail that we could no longer cut. The realization settled on me like a pall of frozen smoke. We were doomed from the first moment the order to move was given. The operation was a logistical fantasy, a magnificent delusion orchestrated by a man who had long since divorced himself from the realities of warfare. I turned to Heydrich. We stopped the reckless push, informed the divisional commanders, prioritize defense, consolidate our positions along the most defensible ridge lines. I will no longer tolerate the burning of fuel for minor advances. We hold what we have until the fuel arrives. And if it doesn't arrive, we fortify ourselves for the inevitable counterattack. It was a direct violation of the Führer's nonstop advance order. It was also the only way to save the core of the Panzer Corps. We were transforming the offensive into a static defense, using our penetration as a final, strong anchor point. Heydrich looked momentarily relieved, then fearful. And if the OKW demands to know why we are stalled, General? Then I will tell them that I am ensuring the survival of the Reich's last strategic reserve of armor, Major. Better to face their fury than to commit mass suicide on the Meuse for lack of a few thousand liters of petroleum. I sat down, feeling the heavy burden of defiance. The worst was yet to come. The forecast was changing. The one thing that protected us, the dense, suffocating fog, was about to lift. Christmas Eve, 1944. A day meant for family, warmth, and hope. Instead, we were shivering in the frozen Belgian woods, listening to the incessant rattle of American machine guns, waiting for the sky to open. The fog began to thin shortly after dawn. It didn't lift suddenly. It withdrew slowly, reluctantly, like a curtain being drawn back on a horrifying stage set. By noon, the sky above the Ardennes was an impossibly bright, clear, ice-blue expanse. The sun, pale and cold, shone for the first time in 10 days. It was the most beautiful and terrifying sight I had witnessed since the war began. The silence that followed the lifting of the fog was temporary, but total. For perhaps half an hour, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the sound came. Not the distant rumble of artillery, but a high-pitched, insistent whine, growing rapidly into a deafening roar. P-47 Thunderbolt. The Allied Air Force had been unleashed. The destruction was immediate and total. Our logistical nightmare, the thousands of vehicles crammed bumper to bumper on the narrow roads, became a pilot's dream target. I was standing near a communications truck when the first wave hit. They came in low, impossibly fast, their wings spitting fire. The sound of their .50 caliber machine guns was a terrifying ripping sound, tearing through metal and flesh. The priority targets were obvious: fuel trucks. I watched a column of 4 fuel tankers, which represented the last hope of pushing my forward elements further, erupt in massive orange-red blossoms. The black, oily smoke billowed upwards, quickly dissipating in the bright air, only to be replaced by the smoke of a dozen other fires. The American pilots were mercilessly efficient. They weren't fighting for territory, they were hunting machinery. They flew circuits, hitting the stationary, paralyzed convoys again and again. Our meager flak defenses were overwhelmed. The young gunners, exposed in the open, fired frantically, creating harmless white puffs far below the swooping fighters. The terror was palpable. Men who had stood firm against tank fire suddenly broke, running from their vehicles and scrambling into the dense woods, knowing that any concentration of steel was now a death trap. Kessler, radio OKW. We are under continuous air attack. We need air cover now. I screamed at the signals officer, though I knew the request was futile. Our fighter reserves were non-existent, committed elsewhere, or destroyed months ago. Kessler's face was smeared with oil and terror. General, the lines are down. They hit the relay station 20 minutes ago. We are cut off. The isolation was complete. We were alone in the enemy's sky, facing an invisible foe whose factories were producing planes faster than we could lose them. I saw a king tiger, a behemoth of armor that had survived the entire Eastern Front, take a direct hit from a rocket. The crew scrambled out, but the subsequent fire ignited the stored ammunition. The tank didn't just burn. It exploded, the massive turret vaulting 20 feet into the air before crashing back down. The cost, both in material and morale, was incalculable. By Christmas morning, the air attacks hadn't stopped. They had become systematic. They didn't just bomb. They strafed anything that moved or anything that looked like it might move. We began to camouflage everything with snow and branches, a futile gesture against aerial reconnaissance. My officers were quiet. They hadn't fled the field, but they were defeated. Not by the strength of the enemy on the ground, but by the overwhelming, unseen hand of American industry in the sky. Major Heydrich found me sitting on the muddy running board of my Panther, watching the distant smoke columns bloom. General, we have lost 40% of our armored transport and nearly all our fuel reserves. The forward units cannot sustain any more offensive action. They are running on fumes. We are essentially stationary. I looked at the sky, now momentarily empty, deceptively peaceful. The miracle never came, Major. We were promised a miracle of will. We got a miracle of clear weather for the enemy. I made the final, painful calculation. My professional duty shifted entirely. It was no longer about victory. It was about survival. If we stayed here, we would be encircled and destroyed, our last panzers turned into scrap metal by bombs, and the impending American counterattack. Prepare the withdrawal order, Major. We begin the slow contraction immediately. We sacrifice the ground gained to save the men and the steel. It was the most difficult order of my career. It meant admitting the failure of Hitler's last great hope. It meant retreating, not under pressure, but under the grim shadow of logistics. We are to pull back, General, without explicit orders from OKW. Heydrich whispered, his eyes wide. We are to save the Corps, Major. The Führer is fighting a war of fantasy. We fight a war of physics. And physics demands we get out of this bulge before it becomes a coffin. The retreat began under the continuous hammering of the Allied Air Force and the increasing pressure of Patton's Third Army, which was now linking up with the surrounded American forces at Bastogne. The orders I issued were precise, cold, and utterly detached from the desperate pleas still crackling over the radio from the OKW, which demanded we hold the line, no matter the cost. Maintain a slow, organized rotation. Priority is the recovery of undamaged vehicles. Anything that cannot move under its own power is to be systematically destroyed by demolition charges. No modern equipment is to be abandoned to the enemy. It was a devastating operation, the planned, deliberate self-destruction of Germany's most powerful armored machines. I supervised the demolitions personally on the 27th near the village of Neuville. The sight was heartbreaking. Young technicians, tears freezing on their cheeks, placing satchels of explosives inside the engine compartment of a magnificent Panther, a machine they had fought and lived in for months. The explosions were dull, sickening thuds, muffled by the snow and the forest. They weren't the clean, sharp explosions of battle. They were the sounds of defeat. Why, General? A young lieutenant asked me, his voice choked. He was covered in soot and clearly exhausted. Why destroy them? We can defend here. I stopped, looking at his idealistic, weary face. We cannot defend anything without ammunition, Lieutenant. And we cannot reach our supplies. If we leave this Panther for the Americans, they will put fresh crews in it, refuel it with their plentiful gasoline, and turn it against us tomorrow. We destroy it now because it is the last service we can render it. It will not serve the enemy. This phase was more harrowing than the attack. We were moving backward over the same choked, cratered roads we had struggled so hard to gain. Now, however, the movement was reversed, and the enemy artillery followed us relentlessly, supported by their ubiquitous air cover. I realized that my decision to pull back early had bought us a critical window. If we had waited even 2 more days, trying to please Hitler, the entire corps would have been cut off by Patton's rapid thrust. To ensure the main force could retreat through the few remaining viable roads, I ordered 2 panzer companies, 10 tanks, including 2 of the last operating King Tigers, to form a desperate, delaying shield. Their mission was suicidal. Hold the crossroads near a place called Seru for 6 hours against the advancing American armored reconnaissance, then attempt to withdraw. I spoke directly to the company commander, Hauptmann Klausmeier, a scarred, veteran officer who knew the meaning of the mission. Klausmeier, this is a sacrifice. Not for the Führer, but for the men behind you. Buy them 6 hours of clear road. Bring back as many men as you can, but do not risk a single American armored vehicle getting through the crossroads. Klausmeier simply saluted, his face grim but resolute. For the Corps, General, we understand the necessity. I watched the 10 tanks rumble into position, their engines screaming their last usable fuel. They were the bones we were throwing to the wolves so the rest of the body could escape. 6 hours later, when the last remaining tanks of the delaying force rejoined the column, only 2 Shermans and 3 half-tracks survived, their paint scorched and their guns silent. I knew that Klausmeier and most of his men had perished. But the road was clear. The sacrifice had been executed with cold, professional efficiency. We finally reached the protection of the old Siegfried Line, the West Wall defenses, in the early days of January 1945. The Corps was shattered. We had lost 70% of our armored strength, either to enemy fire or by our own demolitions. Casualty figures were horrifying. 40% of our frontline personnel were killed, wounded, or missing. We had achieved a deep penetration, caused massive disruption, and inflicted painful casualties on the American army. But the strategic cost was total. The German army had spent its last operational reserve. The teeth of the Panzer Force were broken. I stood stiffly in the cavernous, damp ballroom of a command headquarters well behind the lines, preparing my final report to the OKW liaison, Field Marshal Keitel's deputy. The atmosphere was thick with mutual recrimination. The remaining generals, exhausted and defeated, were already trying to shift blame, the terrain, the weather, the weakness of the infantry. When it was my turn to report, I strode to the map. My uniform was clean, pressed, my boots polished, my posture rigid. I was the image of the professional, detached officer. I would not allow them the luxury of attacking my morale. I gave the report without inflection, listing the facts. The objectives were not met. We did not cross the Meuse. Antwerp remains in enemy hands. The cause was logistical failure, exacerbated by inadequate air cover and unrealistic planning. The deputy, a sleek, pale man named General Jürgens, cleared his throat pompously. General Oberst, your report neglects the fighting spirit of the troops. The Führer believes the spirit of our men could overcome mere material deficits. We suffered a tactical defeat, but we achieved a major strategic delay. I looked directly at Jürgens, ignoring the rank and the potential danger. I spoke slowly, measuring every word. General Jürgens, the bravery of the German soldier is not in question. They fought with tenacity and courage. But bravery does not run the engine of a Panther tank. Fuel does. We were defeated not by American courage, which was certainly present, but by American industry. We were running on fumes from the start. I gestured to the map, tracing the lines of the supply routes. We asked our tanks to move 150 kilometers. We had fuel for 80, based on an optimistic consumption rate. We were forced to rely on captured supplies, a strategic weakness that cannot be overcome by will alone. Furthermore, the moment the sky cleared on the 24th of December, our entire supply chain was annihilated. The enemy air power, supplied endlessly by factories across the sea, removed our ability to maneuver, which is the sole purpose of a panzer division. I stepped back from the map, allowing my gaze to sweep across the room. The Ardennes operation was a logistical impossibility masquerading as a tactical opportunity. We spent the last of our armored reserves, the last of our strategic fuel, and the last of our experienced officers on a gamble that was lost the moment we calculated the difference between German fuel production and American fuel consumption. We threw audacity against the inexhaustible mass of the New World. Mass 1. The room was silent. My words were heresy, a blasphemy against the Führer's philosophy, but they were wrapped in the cold, unassailable language of logistics. They could not argue with the fact that the tanks were now broken or empty. I was not censured. I was simply dismissed, my analysis too toxic, too real, for a command that preferred to live in denial. I left the headquarters and stepped out into the biting January wind. The war was no longer fought on the field. It was fought on the balance sheets of industry. We thought we would wipe them out by striking a weak spot, by shattering their confidence. We thought the softness of democracy would buckle under the sharpness of totalitarian resolve. But the Americans didn't need to be sharp. They just needed to be large. I remembered the young American prisoners, the farm boys in their new coats, scared but well-fed. They were just one small piece of a colossal machine that spanned a continent. Their army, even when surrounded and surprised, had the deep confidence that more ammunition, more fuel, and more men were coming. Not maybe, but certainly. We fought for a glorious, impossible victory. They simply fought to survive long enough for their nation's overwhelming physical capacity to arrive and bury us. The Ardennes was not a battle for a protrusion of territory. It was the moment Germany committed its last great sin, trying to defeat physics with ideology. We didn't lose because we lacked courage. We lost because we ran out of oil, and the sun rose over an enemy who had so much oil they could afford to burn it just to keep their soldiers warm. They were professional, methodical, and relentless. And they had 10 times the weight of steel we did. We thought we would crush them. Instead, they just waited for the clouds to clear, and then they slowly, methodically, ground us into the frozen earth. I pulled my greatcoat tighter, turning my back on the east, where the true final catastrophe was gathering momentum. I had survived the last miracle that wasn't. Now, there was nothing left but the bitter, cold calculation of the inevitable end.